Today's daf, we're going to be learning Bava Batra daf Kuf Nun Bet. This week's learning is sponsored in honor of Alana Storch on her birthday with love from her kids, Ruth, Ira, Elsa, Juliana, Ruben, Elia, Adele, Emmanuel, and Ariane. We are inspired by the example you continue to set for us in your commitment to your learning. Okay, we're going to start our daf. Today we have a lot of debates of Rav and Shmuel about a shchivmera, a person on their deathbed who makes certain statements and does certain actions. So the basis of what we're going to learn is that divrei shchivmera, as we saw yesterday and have discussed many times before, is kichtuvim uchim surim dami. It's as if it was written and as if it was passed over, which means that a person doesn't really need to do any more than that. So we're going to have situations where something more was done, and the question is going to be, what now that more was done, what is the effect of that? Why would someone do more if they don't need to? So itmar, it was said, kinyan. Now we're going to have an itmar is always or almost always an introduction to a machloket between two amoraim, and the structure is usually as follows: subject sentence, then so and so said this, so and so said that, and then next line is so and so said this because blah 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 blah. So and so said that because blah blah blah. It's important to know that because when you get to hear their opinions and you don't really understand them yet, you don't have to worry because the Gemara is going to further explain. So we have a gift that a shchimera gave on their deathbed, and they wrote it down. And in the document, it says, so we have a document that says, so-and-so gave a gift to so-and-so, and as the Rashbam says, gave away all their property, because it's not a matana b'miktzah, but a real classic matnat shchimera. And it said in the document that a kinyan was done. They did what we call a kinyan chalipin, a symbolic act of acquiring. Now, the question is, why was all this done in addition to, you could have just said it, why was it written? Why was there a kinyan done? Rashbam kind of says it doesn't really matter whether it was written. The issue is really that the kinyan chalipin was done. It's a bit of a debate about that, but we're going to put that issue aside. Okay, today's going to be a little confusing, partly because there's a lot of different commentaries, different opinions in the commentaries about what exactly the cases are, and that always leads to some confusion. Speaking about methodological points about what the structure of an itmar is, I'll just remind everybody that tonight is the last in the series of, or today, depending on what time of day it will be for you, the last in the series of Rabbanit Leah Sarna's introduction to beginners Gemara courses, that this is the third in the series. About the logic of the Gemara. If you haven't yet listened, each class is independent. You can listen tonight or today, and you can also, by the way, backtrack and listen to all the others, and everything is digital. You can find it on by clicking on the courses on our website. Bei Rav Mishmei de Rav Amre. So again, back to our case. Amanat Shchimera, who writes in the document, that's written in the document, that there was a kinyan done. Bei Rav Mishmei de Rav, in the Beit Midrash of Rav, they said, in the name of Rav, Arkavei Tre Rikshe. This is like riding on two horses. Okay, we're going to see what that means in a minute. Ushmuel Amar Lo Yadana Mayadumba. And Shmuel says, I don't know how to rule in a case like this. Both very confusing answers. Bei Rav Mishmei de Rav Amre. So as I told you, we're now going to get to what they said in the house of Rav. Arkavei Tre Rikshe, Harehi Kamat Nabari, Harehi Kamat Nachchimera. This is like riding on two horses. Meaning, it's like a matna bari and it's like a matna shchivmera. Okay, we still don't really understand yet. Harehi kamatna bari. In what way is it like a gift given in a person's lifetime, not on their deathbed? She'im amane no chozel. Ham's Rabban says something very basic. Why did you add, if not to give it more strength? What kind of strength are we giving it? More strength that it's effective even if you get better. So, person gets better, the gift is returned to them. Okay, I'm sorry, the gift is not returned to them because if you just said, I'm giving this gift because I'm on my deathbed, it wouldn't be effective if the person got better. So what reason to do a kinyan if not to say, I want this effective no matter what happens to me. I really want to give this gift to this person. Again, they're giving away all their possessions, but still, because they did the kinyan, Rav says, it's as if, right, you're saying, I'm definitely giving it to you no matter what. Well, it is like a matnat shchimera on one element, and this is kind of a side thing, not so germane to our conversation today. You might remember, you can't pass on a milval pet. You have an oral loan. You can't say, oh, you can collect my loan instead of me. But you can do it if you're on your deathbed. So if the person on their deathbed said, I'm passing on this loan to so-and-so, and here's a kinyan, and they do an act of acquiring, in that way, it's treated, even though to a certain extent it's treated like a manapari, for the element of you can actually pass on a loan to someone, an oral loan that there was no document about. In this way, you can. Okay, so if you wrote down in a document, this loan is passed over to so-and-so because this person promised it on their deathbed and did an act of acquiring, it would be effective. And it would be so effective that it would actually click in right away, right? Like a manapari, even if the person got better, it was still passed on. Ushmuel Amar, lo yadana maya dumba. Now, what's Shmuel's concern? Shmuel says, well, Shema. Now, we don't really know. And before we start with Shmuel, I want to give you some background, something we discussed previously, but I'll review. There's two types of documents that are given. One is a document that is just a proof that I did something. So we write it down in a document, like everybody always says now, get it in writing. Right? You write it to give power to the person who's receiving that, to make sure that later, let's say the heirs don't come and say, hey, it's ours. And you say, what do you mean? Here's a document. Your father gave it to me. That's one. A second shtar could be a shtar that affects the kinyan, affects with an E. It causes the kinyan to take effect. That is a different kind of shtar. It's called a shtar kinyan. So now comes Shmuel and he says, listen, when we have this document that says there was a kinyan done, the question was, perhaps, Shema lo gamar laknoto ela b'shtar. Maybe you did the kinyan, but your idea was, when this shtar is given to this person, now you have to realize there's one important thing here, which is that Shmuel understands this shtar was written in the words of a shchiv mera. It was written as this person on their deathbed gave this as a gift to someone and did an act of acquiring, but perhaps they only wanted the act of acquiring to go into effect when the shtar was given to them. Now, when can the shtar be given to them? Well, it's a gift for after their death. So maybe they only wanted it to do with shtar, and ein shtar lachar mita. And then this shtar would only go into effect after the person died. And there is no such thing. You can't give a shtar to someone when you're dead. So the shtar actually, forget about that, according to Rav, it goes into effect. And even if you get better, the shtar is a shtar and the gift is a gift, no matter what. Shmuel says the exact opposite. Perhaps this is not a valid procedure at all. Because perhaps this person didn't exactly know how things work. And they thought that they could, in this way, do an act of acquiring and basically have the shtar go into effect and affect the transaction upon their death. And since that's not doable, and what they didn't realize was you can't do a shtar after death. And therefore, and as they thought, obviously what they thought is, well, I'm doing the transaction now that's going to be indicative of the shtar creating effect of the document. In other words, perhaps what Shmuel's saying is, perhaps the person only wanted the transaction to take effect when they got the shtar and the rights to the object. And then the shtar would affect the transaction, and the shtar can't do that once the person's dead. You can't have a transaction between two people and one of them is dead. So comes Shmuel and basically says, I'm not sure, maybe that's what the person meant. And since I don't know what the person meant, I don't know whether they meant it to be a shtar raya, a shtar giving power. We're going to call this actually liapotet kocho, to strengthen the position of the recipient, in which case it would be good. Or maybe they wanted the shtar to actually affect the transaction, which doesn't work because the shtar would only go into effect after death. So that's the problem. And therefore, according to Shmuel, it's a totally ineffective action. Even though a kinyan was done, it actually caused it to be worse. Okay, this is when you say if you do too much, right? Kol hamosif goreah. If you add, it actually sometimes is worse. So if the person just said, I want to give it to so-and-so, it would have worked. But because they said, I want to give it to so-and-so and did a kinyan and wanted the shtar to be written about it, right? Or wrote the shtar, but the shtar can't, and perhaps the shtar was to affect the transaction, this whole thing is ineffective entirely. So now the Gemara is going to point out, Derami derava derav udeshmuel adeshmuel. But now they're going to bring some other case, which seems very similar. And Rav and Shmuel are actually going to say opposite things to what they said here. Dishalach Rav mishmei Rabbi Abau. Rav sent in the name of Rabbi Abau. Rav, being from Israel, sent in the name of Rabbi Abau to Babylonia and told the people, Havayade sheshalach Rabbi Elazar legola mishum Rabbeinu. Rabbi Eliezer sent to the Gola. Okay, he also sent in the name of Rabbeinu. Now, Rabbeinu is Rav. Okay, he sent in the name of Rav the following halacha. Shchivmera she'amal kitvu tnu maneh leploni v'meit. Shchivmera says, write and give this document and the money, basically saying that I am giving 100 zuzim or dinarim, it's all the same, to so-and-so, and then dies. What do? Do we write and give it? Okay, so what would you say? Shmuel would say, what do you mean? The shtar is affecting the transaction, and you can't do that after mitah. Well, according to Rabbeinu, which is Rav, Ein kotvim v'notzim. You can't write and give this document if the person died before the document was given. Shema lo gamar laknoto ela b'shtar, because maybe, right, the transaction wasn't done then. Maybe the person intended the transaction only be done when the shtar is given. In this case, the shtar wasn't given yet, and ein shtar lachar mitan. You can't give a shtar after death. Now that's Shmuel's words, but here we see it in the name of Rav. And Rav, in our case, said if you did a kinyan, right, it's effective immediately, and no matter what, it's going to work, even if you don't, right? Even if the person doesn't die. And here, Rav says, no, nothing takes effect. And Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, and Shmuel says, Hilchatas, also surprising. The halacha is, kotvim v'notnim. You write it and you give it. Kasha de Rav, kasha de Shmuel, right? So Rav contradicts, because Rav has this whole thing about, aren't we worried it's a shtar kinyan, and that can't be in effect after death. And Shmuel, remember, in this case, the person actually died. And Shmuel said, we write it and we give it. How could Shmuel say we write it and we give it? What, isn't he worried about a shtar kinyan? So how do we explain this? To which the Gemara answers, they're going to do each one separately. De Rav lo kasha. Don't worry about the contradiction in Rav, because there's a big difference between the cases. Ha de kanu mine, ha de lo kanu mine. The first case, we saw there was an actual kinyan done. Notice this second case. I didn't focus on it because I wanted you maybe to notice on your own, or if not, I'll point it out now. Which is the second case, someone said, write and give to so-and-so, but there was no actual act of acquiring. In the first case, it was an act of acquiring. That showed seriousness of purpose and finality. The kinyan was done then. But in the second case, the kinyan wasn't done. Someone just gave a command and said, please write and give this to so-and-so. But it wasn't done. It can't be done after death. So there's a huge distinction here, because one is there was an actual transaction done, and therefore it was effective immediately. The second one, there was no transaction done, so it wasn't effective, and it would only go into effect upon death, because the person died before the document was written and given. And therefore, you have to worry that, right, that makes sense, obvious concern. Well, now the problem is going to be Shmuel. If it's an obvious concern, how can you write and give the shtar after death? There's no shtar after death. How can Shmuel say you can? So, and it not only, number one, how can you even say you can? And number two, it totally contradicts what he said in the first case. Dishmuel lo kasha, and the answer here is going to be what we call an ukimta. It's a different type of answer. Rav says the two cases were different, and you could see that from what was said, the description of the cases. One had a kinyan, one didn't have a kinyan. Shmuel, remember Shmuel's whole concern. Was it a shtar raya, a shtar to prove, a shtar liapotet kocho, to strengthen the giver, just to have a proof? Or was it a shtar that was going to affect the transaction with an E effect? So now comes Shmuel and says, well, the second case doesn't contradict the first, because the second were different circumstances that weren't as obvious, like Rav said, where this had a kinyan, that didn't have a kinyan, it was obvious in the details. But Shmuel and Shmuel Akasha, we're going to add something. Bim miyapet kocho. The second teaching of Shmuel was only in a case where the person made it clear, the one on their deathbed, made it clear what her intention was. Her intention was to give, that you write this shtar, that she said, write and give this shtar to so-and-so. Her intention was, and we'll see later how we would know this, was specifically write it to give them proof that I already gave it to them. But it was a shtar raya. A shtar is a proof. It was a shtar, or as the Gemara says, shtar yipoi koch. Okay, yipoi koch is actually power of attorney in modern Hebrew. But here, liapotet kocho means to give the recipient strength, that they had proof that it was actually given to them. So in case the heirs come later and say, this was ours, the person will pull out a document. That can actually be written after death, because that's just proof of what happened, what transpired during life. So the person said, I want to give this money, and therefore it's as if it was written and done. That worked. The shtar gets written now because the shtar is written as proof. But it only works, and this doesn't contradict the Shmuel in the earlier case, it only works if it was clear as liapotet kocho. If it wasn't made clear, which again, we'll see in a bit how it's made clear in the wording of the shtar, If it wasn't made clear, then it would revert back to the original, which then we don't know, and then we can't write the shtar after death. Yativ Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak acharei de Rava. We're now going to have a little bit of description before we get to another difficulty with Shmuel in the first ruling of Shmuel in today's daf, which is this whole concern that maybe really the person, right, she wanted the shtar to be the shtar that affected the kinyan. So we get a bit of a description. If you remember, the rows of the Beit Midrash were according to prominence. So the back row here, there's 3 rows, at least of what they're discussing here. Yativ Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak acharei de Rava. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak was behind Rava. V'yativ Rava kamei de Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman was in front of and Rava was in front of Rav Nachman. There's a different Rav Nachman, not the same Rav Nachman. Kabai mine, and he asked the following question. So Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question. Let me see one quick thing. So Rav Nachman, he asked Rav Nachman the following question. Right. Okay. Mi amar Shmuel. Shema lo gamar laknoto ela b'shtar ve'en shtar la'acharmita. So Rava starts asking Rav Nachman, the senior, and says, did Shmuel really say this? Shmuel said in the beginning of today's daf that maybe he only acquired it with a shtar and there's no shtar after mita. Maybe he wanted the whole shtar, the whole transaction to be effected with a shtar, and that won't work after the person dies. And then again, this is a meaningless action. Didn't Rav Yehuda say in the name of Shmuel the following thing? A shchimera who writes all of his property to other people. This is exactly the first case, even though there was a kinyan done, an act of acquiring. Amad, if the person got better, chozel, the matana goes back to the original owner, right, the one who was on their deathbed, turning now to amabed. Because it was known that the kinyan was only because the person was going to die. But they didn't mean to give it if they got better. Now, what's obvious from here, what's implied? If they get better, the gift goes back to the original owner. But if they died, since, right, what does it say? The kinyan was only because they thought they were going to die. If they died, then the money goes to all those other people. Now, remember what Shmuel said. Shmuel said, what do you mean? If it was done with a kinyan, we're concerned that the act of acquiring was to say, I want this all to go into effect when the shtar is written and given, and that would be only after death, and ein shtar lachar mita. So, how can you explain this contradiction in Shmuel? To which, Achvele biyade ve'ishti. Rav Nachman makes a gesture to Rava and is silent. But we don't know what kind of gesture. Maybe the gesture was indicating already the answer, or maybe it was dismissing him and saying, come on, go figure this out yourself. It's obvious. We don't know exactly. But somehow Rava figures out the answer. Kikam, when Rav Nachman got up to leave, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak le Rava, my achvelach. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says to Rava, what was he showing you? Amar le b'miyapet kocho. He said, he was showing, he was doing it. This was in a case, same thing as we answered for the first question against Shmuel. It's the exact same answer. This case was where it was written in the language of yipoik liapotet kocho, to strengthen that person's position. Okay? So now, and therefore, again, this doesn't contradict Shmuel because the case was different. But again, it's a case being different, not because it looked like the case was different. The case just said, Shlibirah, who wrote all of his nechasim to others, even though he did a kinyan, he can change his mind, but right, and as if he got better, it would go back. But if the person died, it would have gone up to those people. That's only if the language was liapotet kocho, the shtar, that I want a shtar to be written, or there was this, right. The reason the kinyan was done was in order to strengthen the person's position, and then you'd be able to, let's say, write the shtar after death, and also be able to go to them after death. But if it wasn't liapotet kocho, then we'd have to be worried that maybe the kinyan was showing the person actually wanted it to all to be done with a document after their death, and that isn't going to work because ein shtar lachar mita. Okay, now we finally get to the question. How would you know if it's miapeh kocho, which we discussed in these two answers to the contradictions against Shmuel? You say, and I'm doing a kinyan, right, which is adding on to the gift, this gift. Meaning, I gave you this gift already, and the kinyan is in addition. And then it's obvious that the kinyan is in addition, and not that the kinyan is symbolic of the fact that you want it to be in a much more serious way, which would only happen with a shtar, and that would only happen after death because it was a gift on one's deathbed, which means we're not going to do it when you're alive because you're not giving it yet until you die, and that only goes into effect when the person's dead, and that can't happen because you can't have a shtar. That would be after someone's death. So that explains the two contradictions against Shmuel, and we resolve the contradiction against Rav, that Rav would distinguish between if there was a kinyan, if there wasn't a kinyan. Amar of Pshita. Now the Gemara is going to go into another debate between Rav and Shmuel. Katav lezeh v'katav lezeh. What if somebody writes a will to one person and then decides later to write all their money to somebody else? This is what Rav Dimi said when he came from Babylonia, from Israel to Babylonia, and he said, we saw this already. That we actually saw it. It was mentioned, by the way, because they were mentioning some other things. A will cancels out another will. Meaning, when a person dies, we go by the date on the last will, right? It would have been smart if the person had ripped up the old one, but we go by the last date. But what if? Katav v'zika lezeh v'katav v'zika lezeh. Zika with a kaf, not zika with a kuf, which we learned a lot about in Yevamot. Zika with a kaf is lizakot, like zakin la'adam shelo b'fanav. One can pass on ownership rights of something. So, what if someone wrote a will and then gave the will to someone to acquire it on behalf of somebody else? Now, it's a little tricky here because it's not that an act of kinyan was done. It's not like the person lifted a handkerchief, a symbolic kinyan, which we were talking about before. It's just the document was handed over to accept the document on behalf of some other person. Okay, so let's say we have the person on their deathbed. She wants to give over all of her possessions to Ruth. And she asked Naomi she passes the document to Naomi to give to Ruth. So now this is not a kinyan. The question is, does it show enough seriousness of purpose that this is final and can't be undone? Or, right? So what if katav v'zika lezeh and then katav v'zika lezeh? What if she did it twice? First, she gave it to to Naomi on behalf of Ruth, and then she gave it to someone else on behalf of somebody else, okay? And changed her mind. So the question is, did Ruth acquire it already and it's too late to give to someone else? Or we say, just like a written will can override a written will. Even if you gave it to the person, it could still override because we want to go by what the person wanted last. Now, so Rav Amal Rishon Kana, Ushmuel Amal Sheni Kana. So Rav says the first one acquires it, and Shmuel says the second one acquires it. Okay, right? There's always this concern that we want to do what the person on their deathbed wants. And we learned already, Shemati Taref Da'ato Alav. We don't want them to get all upset and worked up. In fact, Alana Stein-Hain's shiur went up late this past week because she actually lost her voice. Not the easiest thing for a teacher, but it went up on Friday, I think, or Thursday afternoon, all about this Shemati Taref Da'ato Alav, okay? And this whole concept of how this comes into play, and very interesting shiur, so recommend it if you haven't seen it yet or listened. So basically, Shmuel says the second one acquires it. Again, we want to do what the dead person, the person on their deathbed wanted. So Rav Amar Rishon Kana, Harei Kamat Nabari. Rav says Rishon Kana because you were Zika, you already gave the document. Again, this matches what Rav said previously. Once you do something in addition that you didn't need to do, you could have just written it, it would have been enough. Or said it would have been enough. Why'd you give it? Must be you wanted to say this is even, right? Even if I don't die, the woman was saying. Shmuel says, no, second person acquires because it's the manat shchimera, and you can always change your mind, right? And do something else. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Isn't this the exact same machloket as the first machloket on today's daf? How we treat when someone does this, right? Is a manat bariyas or manat shchimera? Okay, where Shmuel, right? Rav says it's a manat bari. It's going to be effective no matter what happens. Why do you do that extra action if not that? And Shmuel says, no, your extra action is nothing. We just treat it according to the basic laws of shchimera. And in fact, right there was a kinyan, so we had to worry about a shtari and shalach harmita. Here it's a different issue. It's which one is the one who acquires it, and it's going to be the second one. So now we say, right, they already had this debate, so it's really the same issue. To which the Gemara says, no, sricha. Why do we need them both? What's the difference? Zika is not the same as kinyan. in the first case, there was an actual kinyan. You might have thought, when there's a kinyan, Rav says that shows seriousness of purpose. But just passing over the shtar without doing a kinyan doesn't necessarily show that. And therefore, maybe he would agree with Shmuel that we view this as a classic manat shchimera. V'it mar baha karma Shmuel. Avabahach ema modele l'Rav. And if you had it, and this is the same logic, you had it just in the second case, you would say that's where Shmuel says we're going to treat this as a manat shchimera. But perhaps if you went so far as to actually do a kinyan, maybe Shmuel would agree with Rav. And therefore, tzricha, that's why we had to say they argue in both cases so that you know they argue across the board whether you did a kinyan or whether you did the zikah and just passed the document on. Okay? Either which way, now it's different ramifications, but either which way, according to Rav, we view this as a manabari, because why did you add something if not to switch it out of the laws of shchimera and kind of override laws of shchimera and say we want this to be applicable no matter what? And according to Shmuel, it stays in the realm of manat shchimera. And then again, once there was a kinyan, maybe you wanted it to be done with a shtar, and then we have to worry about that. Here, there's no concern about that, and therefore it's just zikah, right? You were mizaka, you passed over the shtar, and therefore it goes to the second and not to the first, because the second overrides the first. Now the Gemara is going to say, and there's a bunch of different interpretations of this line, besura manu hachi, but pubedita manu hachi. What we've learned until now, and it's a question what this is referring to, the Rashban first suggests and quotes people who think this is referring back to the first machloket we saw today. But we're going to go with the Rashbam's second interpretation, that it's really referring to the zikah lezeh v'zikah lezeh, okay, where the issue is one person shifted from one to the other, right? Decided to give it to one, gave them a document, and then shifted and gave it to a different person. And now we're going to read what they're going to tell us is they have a different version of what Shmuel said. Shalchule, so b'pubedita, this is their version. Amar of Yomi Abar Abba, Shalchule mibei Rav l'Shmuel. So they sent, after Rav died, they sent to Shmuel, and they wanted to know what does Shmuel have to say about this. He was the Gadol Hador, the important, prominent person at the time, right? Once Rav died, so they wanted to send their questions to Shmuel. They said, please teach us. Shchiv mera shekatav kol nechasav la'achirim v'kanu miyado mahu. If a shchiv mera writes all of their possessions to others and did a kinyan, okay, now, so if they passed their possessions to someone and did a kinyan, mahu. So what is the halacha? To which shalach lehu ein achar kinyan klum. Once a kinyan is done, it's a done deal. And the first person gets it, the second person does not get it. Okay, now this is different than what we had Shmuel saying earlier, because Shmuel said earlier when a kinyan's done, right? Kinyan, well, maybe they wanted it to only be effective with a shtar. And in the zikah lezeh said it goes to the second person. But here, Shmuel's saying it goes to the first person. So we're going to get more into this in tomorrow's daf, and we'll come back and start with a version of Pubedita in tomorrow's daf, and we'll deal with this more head on. So what we did today is we started with this manat shchimera that has a kinyan, has this added element, right? It was actually a shtar and it had a kinyan. And we had this machloket Rav and Shmuel. How do we view this? Do we say the added gives more, or the added actually makes it less effective? Because maybe it was only meant to be a shtar, and that can only take effect till after death. And we dealt with these distinctions between shtar raya, a shtar that's just there to prove to miyaped kocho, to strengthen the position of the recipient, or a shtar that was meant to be actually affect the kinyan, the acquisition. So then we brought this contradiction of Rav and Shmuel, and we resolved it according to Rav, right? One is a kinyan, one there was no kinyan at all, right? That was where someone commanded, please give and write and give this document and this money. Shmuel, or Rav actually said, right, we don't write it because maybe they meant it to be a shtar kinyan. And we say, oh, that's because there wasn't a kinyan actually. When there's a kinyan, it's effective immediately. When there's no kinyan, though, you have to worry that maybe they wanted the shtar to affect the kinyan, and that can't happen after death. And where Shmuel said, we do write it, and then we said, how could Shmuel say that? And we said, we did nukimta. We said, oh, it must be b'miyapet kocho. Then we had another question. The Rava asked Rav Nachman about another case where Shmuel seemed to indicate that it would actually be effective. And we're not worried the shtar was meant to affect the transaction. And again, we said there, it's only when the person made it clear that they were only doing it to strengthen the recipient and as a proof and not as actually affecting the transaction. So really, Shmuel didn't really contradict himself if we resolve it by giving these ukimtas. Then we said, what does it mean, liapot koho? How do we know? And it's this language of this is added to that. And then we finished with this case of zikah, katav v'zikah lezeh, and then gave it to somebody else. If you give to two different people, it's the first one acquire it and with the whole reason why you passed over the star was to give the first person definitive ownership and that you won't change your mind about it, and therefore the second is irrelevant. Or according to Shmuel, no, actually the second one is the most relevant because we always accept what a shchimera wants at the end and not right what they did originally, even if they did this zikah. And then we had this other version of Pumbedita of the opinion of Shmuel, and we'll go back to that when we get to tomorrow's daf. So wishing everyone Shavua Tov, maybe a safe day, and B'sorot Tovot.